is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Live from London, this is Global Business.
Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Jamie Owen.
And I'm Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. A direct hit on Kharkiv's main square. Ukraine accuses Russia of a war crime over the bombing of its second city.
Satellite images show a huge column of Russian tanks heading for Kyiv as Russia tells civilians near military buildings to move to safety.
Standing ovation for Ukraine's president. Volodymyr Zelensky appeals for more help from the EU and immediate membership.
And the list of companies cutting ties to Moscow gets ever longer. The world's largest container line suspends shipping to Russia. The Russian Defense Ministry is warning residents in Kyiv that it's preparing to strike military targets in the Ukrainian capital. The announcement follows accusations by Ukraine that Russia is conducting war crimes by deliberately targeting civilians with missile strikes.
Western allies had feared Russia could resort to more devastating tactics after failing to capture a major Ukrainian city over the past 6 days of their invasion. The Institute for the Study of War has released its latest assessment of the invasion. It says the Russian military is reorganizing its strategy after poor planning and tougher resistance than expected. Russian forces continue to pour into Ukraine from the north, south and east of the country.
Our correspondent Rahul Pathak reports on the day's events.
The sixth day of the Russia-Ukraine conflict saw heavy shelling in Ukraine's second city, Kharkiv, in the east, previously home to 1.4 million people. Freedom Square in the centre of the city was badly hit, with extensive damage to local government buildings. Rescue crews rushed to the scene. Several people were picked out of the rubble alive. Others were not so lucky. Meanwhile, in the north of the country, satellite images picked up a much larger Russian military convoy than initially thought, stretching 64 kilometres all the way to the northwest of the capital, Kiev. Further reports have stated that ground forces and ground attack helicopters are preparing for action in southern Belarus, just over 30 kilometres north of the Ukraine border. The Ukrainian president addressed his nation on Wednesday.
A terror that aims to break us, our resistance. They are coming to our capital just as they did to Kharkiv. Therefore, the defence of the capital today is a key priority for the state. In all cities, Ukraine must do everything possible to stop the enemy.
Several districts in separatist-controlled Donetsk were without power following explosions. West of the city, the Interfax news agency reported Russian forces took control of two towns, Enerhodar and Bernyansk, in addition to a nuclear power plant in Zaporizhzhia. For its part, Russia's foreign minister has criticised EU sanctions against his country, claiming it was hindering diplomatic efforts to solve the crisis. The first round of talks between both sides ended with no agreements. A second round of negotiations is due to take place on the Polish-Belarusian border on Wednesday. Rahul Pathak, CGTN.
Well, let's talk now to our correspondent Peter Dickinson, who is in western Ukraine. So, Peter, reports coming in that missile strikes have now taken place on Kyiv. What's the latest you're hearing?
Well, the last I've seen in the last few minutes has been missile strikes on the Kiev television tower, which is a huge structure of communications in the centre of the in Kiev city, which is the focus for a lot of the TV channels in the country. And reports are coming in that TV channels are down, that people have lost their connections, have lost the signals to watch their TV channels. So this is a classic Russian strategy. When Russia took over Crimea in 2014, and when the Russian forces moved into East Ukraine months later in the spring of 2014, the first targets of those operations were the local TV broadcasting facilities, to make sure they seize control of the broadcasting and to stop Ukraine from being able to put across its messages. It's underlining the importance of information in Russia's war, the Putin doctrine of war. So this attack is very much par for the course in that sense. The Ukrainian authorities have said that they believe they will soon be able to get the television signals back up and running via secondary backup facilities. But that remains to be seen. We'll have to see whether they're able to do so or not. There have been air raids throughout the day in Kiev, and we expect another very traumatic evening for people in Kiev, which most will be spending in makeshift bomb shelters or in the city's extensive metro system, which is serving as a refuge for people looking to escape the Russian bombing.
And this marks something of a new phase in the invasion, doesn't it? Do you think it will change the mood in Ukraine?
Well, it's an ominous development. We've been expecting this in the last couple of days. The first few days of the campaign were marked by some remarkable setbacks for the Russian military. The original plan, as it was laid out and as it was predicted in advance, and as it panned out, was to have lightning strikes on a number of major Ukrainian cities, primarily Kiev. The Russians hope to seize cities, and particularly Kiev, and decapitate the Ukrainian government, essentially, and establish their own puppet regime. That didn't pan out, and the Ukrainian forces were able to put up far stronger resistance than Russia had anticipated, and now, 6 days in, they've still failed to capture any major cities. So the fear now is very much that Russia will resort to terror tactics. They will escalate in the indiscriminate bombing of towns and cities. We've seen the airstrikes in Kharkiv in the last couple of days against residential buildings, against the administrative buildings in the very heart of the city, where there's no possible justification in terms of military targets. The fear is now that will escalate in Kiev as well, and of course on people's minds is very much the fate of Aleppo at the hands of Russian bombs, and before that, Grozny, the capital of Chechnya, both cities which were literally reduced to rubble by Russia, by Putin, and the fear is that we may now see similar tactics applied to Ukraine, as unbelievable as that may sound.
And do you think this might signal a change in tactics from the Ukrainians now?
Well, the Ukrainian side has fought very valiantly, but they are also aware that there's huge pressure on the country and that there are huge pressure on the civilian population. I think that Ukrainians will be looking first and foremost from a humanitarian point of view to try and pressure Russia on the international scene to avoid atrocities, to avoid crimes against humanity. But there seems to be very little they can do, really. They are in a very weak position from a negotiating point of view. There are Russian soldiers all over the country. Russia's made very clear that it will not compromise. So Ukraine's position is really surrender or continue its resistance. It's hard to see how they could change tacks at this point without simply conceding to Russia's demands.
Peter Dickinson in Western Ukraine, thanks very much indeed for that update.
Boris Johnson says the UK could take in up to 200,000 Ukrainian refugees, but cannot offer direct military assistance to Ukraine.
The British Prime Minister is visiting Poland and Estonia to offer support in the conflict. At a press conference in Warsaw, Johnson faced emotional questioning from a Ukrainian activist.
Because you are afraid. Because NATO is not willing to defend. Because NATO is afraid of World War III, but it is already started. I see that my family members, that my team members are saying that we are crying. We don't know where to run.
When you talk about the no-fly zone, as I said to Volodymyr Zelensky, I think a couple of times, unfortunately the implication of that is that the UK and will be engaged in shooting down Russian planes, will be engaged in direct combat with Russia. That's not something that we can do or that we've envisaged.
Much more on that coming up later. You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, escaping the bombing. Refugees from Ukraine seek a welcome on the Hungarian side of the border.
Ранним утром 24 февраля Владимир Путин заявил, что в ответ на обращение руководителей республик Донбасса принял решение провести специальную военную операцию.
Now, from what we're hearing, definitely hear those air raid sirens in the background again, which means we might have to head inside at some point.
Действительно тревожной была прошлая ночь в украинской столице.
We're hearing that a number of points of military infrastructure in Ukraine.
Сейчас съемочная группа находится в больнице Петровского района Донецка.
We're seeing people with suitcases scurrying about, but getting out to where? They're not quite sure.
15 часов проехали, пробыли в пути. Пока ехали...
Events have consequences. Words create impact.
One more offensive in a long line of battles that's been ongoing for more...
Just got to be careful here with some gunshots. Excuse us, excuse us.
The world today matters for your world tomorrow.
The number of casualties is growing quickly.
Why, this is one of the hardest hit towns in the region.
The world today, every day on CGTN.
The world has changed under the pressure of the pandemic. For many of us, life is returning to some kind of normal. As we're adapting to changes in all of our lives, let Global Business Europe be your guide to the new normal. Join us weekdays on CGTN.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe. Just a reminder for you that CGTN is available to watch for free on all the major digital platforms, on Smart TV or online on Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube and Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app, and in the UK on Freeview.
We're just going to show you some footage that we're getting from Kyiv. This is the TV tower in Kyiv, in the centre of town. You're seeing a plume of smoke there. We're not quite sure if the TV tower was directly hit, but obviously the hit is pretty nearby. This footage is appearing on social media and press agencies, but it shows the aftermath of the explosion in the area. Let's talk now to Alina Frolova, who's a former Deputy Minister of Defence in Ukraine. I know you're probably not able to see these pictures, but you will know what's happening. In fact, what is happening where you are? What are you seeing? What are you hearing? Your reaction to this attack on Kiev in the last few moments?
Well, they actually had, first of all, hi, yes, and thank you for paying attention. Kyiv actually has today alerts, I don't know, 20 times or something like this about the shelling. So that's not the first one, and that's constantly appearing. Yeah, now we have a loss of many channels, transmitting. The official channels said that they will be switched to some kind of analog transmitting within the next moments, and then in a few hours they expect to stabilize the situation. So, but yeah, that's very important to have connection, to have internet connection, because people get the information. But at the same time, I should tell you that we have much more devastating results of Russian occupation, attempt of occupation here, of Russian war. They hit in not only the transmitters, they hit in the kindergartens, like daily care centers, shelters with children, with adult people. So this is a huge war against the civilian population.
Can you tell us what you, sorry to interrupt you, I just want to establish what you have seen in terms of damage to civilian areas, civilian casualties?
A lot. We've seen a lot, and there are many casualties, many life lost, kids are dying. And that's one of the most difficult parts of the war here, that you cannot stop it and you cannot help it for now. So we also have, they are specifically hitting the civilian infrastructure, and they are trying to demoralize our people. So we're holding on. I should tell you, we're holding on.
If this is the start of Russia intensifying its bombardment of Kyiv, what do the coming days hold for you? How will you hold out?
Well, we are a strong nation. We're in war with this enemy not last 8 years. You know, they were trying to occupy us and to keep us under control for last more than 300 years. And we have this knowledge and remembrance from the older time. Last 8 years also make us much stronger. And now, you know, all my foreign friends, including militaries, they were absolutely sure that we won't hold on for the first day even. I should tell you that we prevail. We prevail in all the operation. We prevail on the, like, in air, on land. Yes, we're losing people. We have like a massive attacks on civilians and infrastructure. But from the results, our losses is like 5-10 times less on some marks than Russian losses. They have a demoralization. They have now lack of the fuel. So this is not about that we won't stand on. We will win this war. That's obviously, absolutely, everyone is sure about this. This like a territorial defense. These volunteers who work in army. We have the strongest army in the world. I'm absolutely sure in this now. But the issue is, and this is not the we will stand 1 day, 2 days, as much as it's necessary. Yes, and we really appreciate the help with weapons, with equipment, which we received. Which we're receiving, like multiple receiving from our Western partners. So you can be sure that we will hold on. The issue is that we can minimize the losses, and this is what we all should be targeted at. And we should put as much effort as possible into the elimination of this threat, not only to Ukraine, but this is a threat to the whole world, and finally the Europe in these 2 days.
Alina Frolova, we wish you well, and thank you very much indeed for talking to us. Alina Frolova, the former Deputy Minister of Defence in Ukraine.
Thank you. Thanks.
Western sanctions against Moscow have triggered a currency crisis in Russia. The ruble is trading near a record low after plunging nearly 30% on Monday. It's expected to create a shortage of essential goods across the country. Let's talk now to our correspondent Giles Gibson in Moscow. So, Giles, are the sanctions now beginning to bite?
Well, Robin, it's been another day when we've seen Russians queuing up at ATMs and banks in cities all over the country, trying to get hold of any cash that they can get their hands on, but particularly trying to get hold of foreign currencies such as the US dollar. That's in the wake of the ruble just plunging dramatically against the euro, the dollar, the pound, once markets opened up on Monday after those sanctions came in over the weekend. We've had some response from the Kremlin talking about how they are trying to respond to these sanctions from the West. The Russian Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin saying that he is taking personal charge, personal responsibility for the response from the Kremlin, also saying that he believes that this pressure that's coming down on the Russian economy will eventually subside. But you just have to look at the stampede of international companies, international corporations who are heading for the exits from the Russian economy to see, a hint of what the Russian economy is going to look like over the next few years or so. Just in the last 24, 48 hours, we've had Visa, MasterCard, Uber, and the two oil giants, BP and Shell, all saying that they are trying to extricate themselves from joint ventures, partnerships here in Russia, and some of them are prepared to take a hit of several billion in order to do so.
And Giles, Russia's media coverage of the invasion of Ukraine seems to have changed.
Yeah, there's been one significant development in the sense that Russian officials are now acknowledging that there have been some casualties on the Russian side, although they are not telling us any sort of breakdown about how many Russian soldiers have potentially been killed or wounded in this action. I can tell you that one thing that is not changing is the justification that we're hearing from top Russian officials for launching this military offensive. Take a listen to the Russian Defense Minister, Sergei Shoigu.
Our main goal is to protect Russia from military threats created by Western countries that try to use Ukrainian people to fight against our country. The Russian army is not occupying Ukraine's territory and takes all the necessary measures to save lives and ensure the safety of civilians. I want to stress our strikes are being launched only at military facilities and using exclusively precision-guided weapons.
So the Russian defense minister claiming there that they are only targeting military infrastructure. We had in the last few hours a warning from the Ministry of Defense that they were going to be targeting inside Kiev, inside the Ukrainian capital, the security service of Ukraine. And Jamie, as you were just telling us there, we are now seeing these pictures of smoke billowing out from around a television tower right in the heart of the Ukrainian capital.
Giles Gibson in Moscow, thank you very much.
Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has made an impassioned plea to the European Union to save his country, while also vowing Ukraine would not be beaten. He once again called for Ukraine to be fast-tracked into the EU, receiving a standing ovation. This all comes ahead of a vote by the EU on whether to brand Russia a rogue state and impose even tougher economic sanctions. Well, let's talk to our correspondent Rebecca Bunden, who's in Brussels. Rebecca, what else did Zelensky have to say?
It was really a very emotional appeal from President Zelensky as he appealed to members of Parliament, the European Parliament, for support, saying that the EU is alone. It was a very emotional address where he painted a bleak picture of the situation in Ukraine with innocent people being killed, and he certainly seemed to win over a lot of hearts in Parliament today. Let's have a listen.
We have proven our strength. We have proven that, at a minimum, we are exactly the same as you are. So do prove that you are with us. Do prove that you will not let us go. Do prove that you indeed are Europeans. And then life will win over death, and light will win over darkness.
So the European Parliament has actually voiced a lot of support for Ukraine, including for that bid for candidate status for EU membership. And the European Parliament has also been calling for much tougher sanctions to be imposed by the EU, including restrictions on exports of oil and gas from Russia. However, ultimately, it's not up to the European Parliament to make these decisions. It would be the 27 member states that would have to decide upon this.
Ukraine has officially applied to join the EU. It's not an organisation known for moving quickly. Will they be accepted quickly?
It's a very long, drawn-out process normally that takes many years. First, it has to gain that candidate status, and then even after that, it's a process that really does take a very long time, and it would have to be approved by the 27 member states, and it's not clear that all EU countries would actually be in support of this. There are several countries that have actually supported Ukraine's appeal to get this fast-track process through, including Poland, Slovakia, Czech Republic. But really, it's not something that can happen overnight. And many point out as well that Ukraine at this point needs more immediate help. This would be a process that could just take a long time. It would have to meet all the criteria as well. That's not going to be brushed aside. So this isn't something that can happen overnight, really.
Let's just put the EU to one side for a moment and talk about NATO, because lawmakers in Finland are debating a petition calling for the country to join the NATO alliance, something that President Putin has said will be met with serious military consequences.
Well, yes, Finland borders Russia, so it's obviously a concern at the moment. Lawmakers have been discussing this matter. It's not really clear yet whether it will actually go ahead with an application, but we have to remember the fact that Ukraine in this situation, because it's not a member of NATO, NATO hasn't been able to send troops into the country. It's been sending troops to the European alliance, where its members are. It has been able to send troops there as it prepares or tries to prevent the potential spillover from Ukraine into its member countries. Jens Stoltenberg, NATO's Secretary General, he visited Poland and Estonia today, where NATO has been sending troops. Let's have a listen to what he had to say.
We are increasing NATO presence across the alliance to deter and to defend. And we are stepping up our support to help Ukraine defend itself. NATO allies are sending Ukraine anti-tank weapons, air defense missiles and ammunition. Allies are also providing millions of euros worth of financial help and humanitarian aid.
It's interesting that President Putin, he's trying to weaken the Western alliance, but actually what he seems to have achieved is only greater unity and reinforcement of NATO's powers, as well as a defensive alliance, as countries like Finland now look at the process of potentially joining the alliance.
Rebecca, thanks for that. Rebecca Bunden, our correspondent in Brussels.
US troops have arrived in Germany as NATO strengthens its defences along the alliance's eastern border.
This all comes as the German government prepares to send defensive weapons to Kyiv, just one of several military measures announced by the Chancellor after Russia's invasion triggered a major shift in defence policy. From Berlin, our correspondent Trent Murray reports.
As war rages in Ukraine, European leaders are desperately working to respond to the crisis. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz making a very public plea to President Putin.
Ich will deshalb die Gelegenheit nicht versäumen.
I therefore do not want to miss the opportunity, together with my colleague, to call on the Russian president to immediately cease all hostilities, withdraw Russian troops from Ukraine and resume dialogue. The bloodshed must end. Vladimir Putin abuses the Ukrainian people.
Scholz's warning follows his historic announcement Sunday to break with many of the defence doctrines that have dominated Berlin's foreign policy agenda in recent decades. Germany is now sending anti-tank and Stinger missiles to the Ukrainian army, while at the same time pledging an immediate cash injection of 100 billion euros for the German military. It's a striking sum, given the annual defence budget had been sitting at around half of that amount. And after years of resisting pressure from NATO allies to up spending, Scholz's government now says Germany will commit in full to the alliance's targets, with 2% of GDP earmarked each year for defence.
Wir erleben eine Zeitenwende.
We are experiencing a turning point, and this means that the world after this is no longer the same as the world before it. In essence, it's a question of whether we allow Putin to turn back the clocks to the time of the great powers of the 19th century, or whether we have the strength to set limits to warmongers like Putin.
But as tensions escalate, NATO members in Eastern Europe are watching nervously. Soldiers from across the region flying in to shore up the alliance's strength on the eastern flank.
Hundreds of extra US troops began arriving Tuesday here in Germany. US Army Command in Europe saying their mission includes operations to deter further Russian aggression and bolster the defensive posture of European allies.
Over 80,000 US troops are already in Europe on rotational and permanent operations. The latest batch landing in Nuremberg, arriving at a time of heightened tensions not known in Europe for decades.
So the first phrase I want to teach is, number one, stronger together. We're stronger together here in Europe. In a NATO alliance, we're stronger together here with our German host.
But as NATO pledges security for its own members, the bloc insists it won't intervene militarily in Ukraine, resisting calls from Kiev to help introduce a no-fly zone over the country. Washington and allies worry that such a move, in the words of NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg, could cause the situation to, quote, spiral out of control and turn into a full-fledged war in Europe between NATO and Russia. Trent Murray, CGTN, Berlin.
Well, let's explore this a bit more now and talk to Ulrich Bruckner, who's a professor for European Studies at Stanford University in Berlin. Thanks very much indeed for joining us today. So what's going on in Germany is really a complete turnaround in its defence policy. How significant is it?
Well, this is truly a historical moment. When the new government started after 16 years of Angela Merkel being the chancellor in Germany, they promised that the country will be a different one at the end of their term. Now, only 100 days later, the country is already a different one, but not exactly what they thought it would be, because they were focusing on climate change. And now they live up to expectations that have been expressed by French President Macron, that Europe should create something what he calls security sovereignty. And every American government didn't get tired to remind us that we should live up to expectations and deliver burden sharing as 2% of our GDP. And what Scholz announced now goes far beyond these 2%.
So this is a huge increase in spending, as well as sending actual military hardware to Ukraine, something Germany's been reluctant to do, given its history with regards to the Second World War.
Well, this government consists of three parties. It's a coalition government. And the Social Democrats were wishful thinkers and those who understand or try to understand Russia, and have always been hoped that Putin is a potential partner and he's just doing weird things. Now they understand that he's a threat to our way of life and to countries in Europe, and that he's willing to start an invasion in a country that hasn't done anything to trigger this. There are also liberals, and they have been into austerity and become the biggest spenders, as the Minister of Finance, who is from the Liberal Party. And last but not least, the Green Party started as a peace movement, and they are the ones to initiate defense weapons for our allies and partners, and even a non-NATO member like the Ukraine. So a lot of things have changed, and ideological guarantees are no longer existent.
So this complete turnaround does damage former German Chancellor Angela Merkel's legacy, doesn't it, in both military and energy policy?
Well, I wouldn't go as far as calling it a damage. We live in different times. No one expected a week ago that this could be an invasion of that dimension. We could go back to times when Putin started with an invasion in Chechnya, and Grozny looked like a German city after World War II. And if things don't continue, can be blocked, then what happens in Kiev will probably not any different from what we've seen in Grozny. So Merkel's 16 years were a different geopolitical environment than it is now, and this was the important moment that Scholz has experienced.
And alongside these changes to defence policy, we've seen the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline stopped. So Germany also reassessing its energy policy.
Well, this was a priority from the start. The three parties were very clear about we have to highlight as a top priority climate change and everything it requires. They announced to fade out from nuclear energy, and they announced to fade out from coal, which means that you cannot instantly also fade out from gas. But gas imports from Russia imply a risk for energy security. And now what Putin certainly didn't want to trigger is a new priority to fade out from dependencies on Russia. This is not just about Nord Stream 2. This is about all the imports that are coming from Russia. And that is a serious threat for the business model in Russia, because it cannot easily compensate the losses that it will face in the midterm perspective from the energy-hungry European countries.
Professor Ulrich Bruckner from Stanford University in Berlin. Great to get your thoughts today. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, airlines face up to lengthy diversions and escalating costs after the EU and Russia each close their airspace to the other.
It is now important that all of us in Europe act very swiftly.
Fines for the non-vaccinated will most likely be between $1,000 and $4,000.
The new Omicron variant circulating in southern Africa.
The financial markets have also reacted badly to the news.
Growing dissatisfaction with the way the Dutch government is handling the pandemic.
Cancelling the city's main public Christmas markets for the second year in a row.
Protests and riots by those opposed to restrictions and vaccinations.
There is no room for complacency in this ongoing battle against COVID.
On the agenda with me, Stephen Cole, we look up into space. We look down into data. We look at debt. We look at politics. We look at opioids, climate change. We look at all the issues that really matter around the world. But you matter too. We want to tell the stories you want to see and hear about. Make it your agenda.
The agreement is signed. But what is the real deal now the UK has left the EU? For trade, for business, for the city, for ordinary people. Make sense of Brexit with CGTN.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and a bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans? Grey rhinos? And unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe with Jamie Owen and Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. Ukraine's emergency services say 5 people have been killed in a Russian attack on Kiev's TV tower. Earlier, Russia warned Kiev residents to leave their homes ahead of targeted strikes on the Ukrainian capital.
Satellite images show a huge column of Russian tanks heading for Kiev as Russia tells civilians near military buildings to move to safety.
Standing ovation for Ukraine's president. Volodymyr Zelensky appeals for more help from the EU and immediate membership.
International investors are struggling to sell off their Russian assets after a raft of Western sanctions threatens to freeze Moscow out of the global financial system. Meanwhile, MSCI, a key asset index, has indicated that it may remove Russia from its influential list, which has helped channel billions into the Russian economy. Let's talk to our correspondent, John Terrett, watching events for us in New York. John, what's happening with Russian stocks?
Well, it's a very interesting story that broke just before the end of the trading day yesterday, Monday. And what's happened is that the NASDAQ company, which is based in Times Square, and the company we know as International Continental Exchange, or ICE for short, which is the owner of many stock exchanges around the world and also the owner of the New York Stock Exchange. They're based in Georgia, in the south of this country, and they have halted all the Russian companies that trade here in New York. Now, I want to emphasize that word halted. Okay, they haven't been delisted yet. We don't know what's going to happen, but for now, these companies and their trades have been frozen as where they closed on Friday evening. Now, when I first looked at this list, it didn't mean much to me, to be honest with you, because these companies don't come up in the news very much here in North America. But when I took a second look, some of them do. One of them, for example, is Meckel, the mining and steel company, which is a global business. Another one is based in Moscow. It's the Mobile Telesystems company, so that's a telecoms company. And the other one I've got here, this exchange here in New York at the Wall Street NYSE Stock Exchange, is called Kian. Now, Kian is an Irish name, but the company, I think, is registered in Cyprus in the Mediterranean. But it's a big Russian-backed real estate company. Now, what's happening is both the NASDAQ and the NYSE are seeking clarification from the authorities in Washington, D.C. about how they should interact with these companies now, given the new tranche of sanctions that has been laid on Russia in the last 6 days. So they're basically seeking clarity. Now, as you rightly say, the global financial giant MSCI, which is based in New York, is saying this morning, look, the natural way to go now is actually to delist these companies, like some of the Chinese telecoms companies were delisted in the early part of last year, but for different reasons, of course. And MSCI says it is considering a blanket removal now of all Russian securities from its portfolios around the world. Now, the thing is that it happens more than you would think. You know, that these stocks are halted. It really does. I think there were 10 just yesterday, for example, for various reasons. They may be reinstated. We don't know. But one thing I can tell you is that investors are very savvy here. They know what the price was on Friday. They'll work out where it's likely to reopen and where it will reopen, and they'll end up making some money on it. But the other point about this is that Bloomberg is reporting that Russia is now uninvestable. I'm not entirely sure that's a real word, but anyway, uninvestable it is, mainly because the ruble is worth just 1 US cent, just 1 American cent for the Russian ruble. And this follows the very stringent ramping up of sanctions yesterday. Americans are now banned from any financial transactions with the central bank, the Ministry of Finance, the Sovereign Wealth Fund, and Putin has a big stash of $630 million in foreign reserves, foreign assets. He's banned from tapping into that in order to sell it to prop up the ruble. So things are looking very, very grim now for the Russian economy.
John, gas and oil are central to the Ukraine crisis. I wonder how the energy sector is reacting there.
Well, bizarrely, you know, it's doing very well. The energy sector has done spectacularly well in the last 2 years. And yesterday, Monday, was the only one of 11 sectors on the broad market, the S&P 500, that was actually in the green. We had the Dow down 0.5%. We had the NASDAQ up by 0.4% because of Bitcoin and cryptocurrency and the role they may play in the future in helping Ukraine. And the S&P 500 was down between 0.25% and 0.33%. But energy was in the green. And commodities are in the front line of this war, if you will, because Russia is not known as the breadbasket of Europe for nothing, and it exports so much. You've got crude, natural gas, coal, wheat, of course, particularly to Africa, places like Tunisia and Egypt, and palladium, which is a little-known metal. It's a very, very rare metal. It's a lustrous, silvery white metal that is used in the computing industry. And so, you know, commodities are really taking a hit right now, and I think Americans, just as a small example, can look forward to paying another 5, 10, 15, 20 cents per gallon almost immediately because of the danger to supplies of crude oil and gas and things like that. And, you know, it's a big problem for the Federal Reserve because they're going to raise interest rates in 2 weeks' time. So they have to walk a very fine line between stifling inflation but not choking off the U.S. recovery, just as this tidal wave of prices is about to hit everybody around the world. Guys?
John, thanks for that. John Terrett, our correspondent in New York.
Well, as we've been hearing, heavy restrictions on Russia have been designed to close off its economy and block it from the global financial system. That's pushing companies to stop sales, cut business ties and dump tens of billions of dollars worth of investments. Our correspondent Juliet Mann is here with the details. Juliet.
Thanks, Robin. Thanks, Jamie. Yes, from payment card firms like Visa to big tech to manufacturing, Russians' isolation from the corporate world is deepening. The message is that for now, at least, as we heard from John, Russia is uninvestable. Now, we've talked a lot over the last couple of days about energy and the oil companies, so let's start with motors today. Global auto and truck makers, including Sweden's Volvo, US General Motors and Germany's Daimler Truck, are suspending shipments to the Russian market until further notice. Now, Volvo sold around 9,000 cars in Russia in 2021. General Motors doesn't have plants in Russia and only sells about 3,000 vehicles a year there and has limited supply chain exposure, but it's a statement nonetheless. And Volkswagen in Russia has temporarily suspended deliveries of cars to dealers until further notice, while Mercedes is evaluating options with its Russian interests. No news yet from Ford, which has a 50% stake in 3 Russian plants, other than saying its priority is the safety of its workers. Let's talk bean counters now. The big 4, we've got KPMG, EY, PwC, and they're all distancing themselves from Russia. And that was after the UK government told the City of London companies not to work on behalf of the Putin regime. On to logistics, and you can see there some of the big shippers and aviation companies, Maersk and MSC, they've stopped all container shipping routes in and out of Russia. So we're talking major shipping routes between St. Petersburg and Kaliningrad in the Baltic Sea, Novorossiysk in the Black Sea, and Vladivostok and Vostochny in Russia's east coast. This is really big. An airplane manufacturer, Boeing, they've paused operations at its Moscow training campus and temporarily closed its office in Kiev. Now, the aviation sector is really feeling it, with Russian flight bans, which have hit airlines from 36 countries. So let's talk a little bit more about that with John Strickland, who's an independent aviation business strategist. Good to see you, John. Thanks for coming on the programme. Now, we know the why, but it's more disruption, isn't it, to a sector that's really struggling?
Yes, yeah, you're right to say the sector has been struggling for the last 2 years because of the coronavirus pandemic on a global basis. And airlines, certainly, if we look at Western Europe and North America, we're starting to get a bit more optimistic about the coming summer season, which, of course, is normally the key money-making time of the year. We've seen markets opening up within Europe, and certainly hopes that the transatlantic is going to get back more to its full vigour in the months ahead. Interestingly enough, in the context of now the war in Ukraine, the one part of the world which was still, so to speak, off limits is Asia. Many countries in Asia are not open at all, including China, when it comes to international passenger travel. And that, in a strange way, is a saving grace right now with the sanctions coming in from Russia on airlines whose own countries have put airspace closures onto Russian carriers, because airlines from Western Europe and indeed other parts of the globe would normally use Russian airspace on overflights, for example, on Europe-Asian services. It's the quickest and most cost-effective route. It is one, by the way, that the Russians earn significant foreign exchange from. But the closure would normally be a big hit, but because these markets from a passenger point of view are effectively out of action right now, the hit is not really very measurable, with one exception, and that is Finnair, which is an airline in Europe which has made a virtue out of its northern location in Helsinki to operate a hub, providing numerous connections from a whole host of European cities to equally a whole host of cities in Asia, including several in China. They issued a release yesterday saying they've had to withdraw all guidance because their business model, in effect, is somewhat grounded at the present time.
So Finnair, more or less grounded, certainly in terms of its business model. Look, I know it's really hard to put a number on these things, but if the ultimate goal is to cripple trade and investment in Russia, can you give us an idea of how this is going to hit passenger numbers and airline revenues?
It is very difficult to say, and at the moment hard to disentangle it from the coronavirus impact. If Asia and China being the biggest market does remain closed for quite some time, and certainly even before this change of status militarily in the last week, most airlines were not expecting any immediate change in terms of opening up for China, then it doesn't make a lot of difference. If we look at non-Finnair figures, for example, British Airways is single-digit exposed to Asia. So provided that the transatlantic market opens up and intra-European markets as well, then airlines can redeploy aircraft onto those markets instead. We're expecting a very buoyant transatlantic market this summer, even more so than usual because of a lot of pent-up demand. But if we do see Asian markets opening up and airlines would be wishing to put aircraft back in, and we'd see normal tourism flows and business flows between China and other Asian countries in Europe, then the hit would be greater. But we're certainly not there yet. And of course, I shouldn't forget that fuel prices, which were already on the rise because of coronavirus, have been pushed up even more now because of the military conflict. That itself is an immediate hit to the bottom line.
John Strickland, thank you very much for your insight. It does seem that the airline sector is in for an even bigger shake-up than we anticipated in the wake of the global pandemic. Now, the corporate list making Russia no-go is getting longer. I've only pulled out a few highlights for you. Now, we know that Putin has made some provisions, and John mentioned this when he was talking from the New York Stock Exchange, provisions for economic sanctions and exclusion from SWIFT. But this is all going to hurt the Russian economy for a long time, Jamie and Robin.
Juliet, thank you very much. The Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, has attempted to justify the invasion of Ukraine as a battle against Nazism and the far right.
Lavrov was speaking to the United Nations Human Rights Council in Switzerland virtually after a ban on flights out of Russia. Lavrov's appearance on the big screen in Geneva was greeted by a mass walkout. Well, our correspondent Andrew Wilson is here with us. So, Andrew, we had those first round of talks at the border. They've finished. Then we've had Sergei Lavrov addressing the United Nations. Has there been any progress?
Yeah, well, the public messaging isn't going too well so far on this, but it's not necessarily a surprise. I mean, those meetings on the border yesterday there's no mediation. It was just a delegation from Russia and a delegation from Ukraine. It was bound to be heated and produce not much in the way of results. Now we have Sergei Lavrov, another direct address. The walkout in Geneva today was quite extraordinary. Delegates up on their feet even before he's appeared on the video screen and making their exit from a hall. A clear, almost unanimous message that they weren't interested in hearing what he had to say. And that's essentially an admission for the United Nations that they knew what he was going to say in advance. Here's a flavour of what Sergei Lavrov had to say today.
The purpose of our action is to save these people by fulfilling our obligations as allies and to demilitarise and denazify Ukraine. This is particularly relevant because the country is being dragged into NATO, flooded with offensive weapons, has openly made territorial claims against the Russian Federation and has threatened to use force and acquire a military nuclear capability.
Well, if choice of words is everything we've heard for the last 6 days from the Kremlin, talking about Russia fulfilling its obligation as an ally of Ukraine, denazifying Ukraine, talked about Ukraine being dragged into NATO. This is still the same story that persists out of the Kremlin in terms of describing what's going on and laying down excuses or reasons for why this invasion has taken place. But the rest of the world is moving on with its own take on what's happening there, not least the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, who also addressed the conference today.
If we cannot come together now, when will we come together? We must send a resolute and unified message that President Putin should unconditionally stop this unprovoked attack, as the Secretary General and the High Commissioner have done, and immediately withdraw Russian forces from Ukraine. We must condemn, firmly and unequivocally, Russia's attempt to topple a democratically elected government and its gross human rights abuses and violations of international humanitarian law. And we must take steps to hold the perpetrators accountable.
Things are obviously changing rapidly on the ground. We've been reporting about the attack on the TV station, the TV transmitter. Just a thought about changes in the diplomatic music over the last few days.
Well, that's where the signs are going to appear, if anywhere, in terms of things changing for the fate of Ukraine and what's going on in terms of this invasion. Now, we're 6 days in. Normally, one would have expected by now, I'm sure the military planners in the Kremlin were expecting by now to have Kiev at least surrounded, if not occupied. That's not happening. The Western world is picking up the language of defiance and the unity within that from all these European countries taking the stand, as well as the United States and further flung countries. The Kremlin still is not changing its story, even though it's becoming clear that the military plan isn't going according to plan. That doesn't change anything, says the Kremlin. The messaging is still the same. But what people want to know is, over time, is the momentum coming out of the invasion? How long is this going to go on for? How long is this going to be taking place right under our noses on the threshold of the European continent? And the answer will be found in the messaging changing coming out of the Kremlin. But thus far, absolutely no alteration. There are plenty of protests, plenty of objection. There's some even within the Russian community not getting even some of the new oligarchs that have been sanctioned recently by the UK. Mikhail Friedman, one of them, Peter Arvan, his partner. Friedman himself said, I can't criticise Putin publicly because that puts my own company in difficulties. He's a dangerous character to cross, and the Kremlin is a dangerous organisation to go against. So people just look at the odd statement that we get from people like Sergei Lavrov to see if there's any chink in the armour, any change in the momentum. Thus far, there isn't any.
Andrew, thank you very much indeed. Our correspondent, Andrew Wilson. Well, China has repeated its call for a diplomatic solution to the Ukraine crisis. Foreign Minister Wang Yi was speaking with his Ukrainian counterpart, Dmytro Kuleba. Wang urged Ukraine to try to ensure the safety of Chinese citizens. Kuleba said Ukraine remains open to negotiations and is willing to strengthen communication with China. Meanwhile, a Chinese national has been shot and injured while trying to leave eastern Ukraine. This all comes as the Chinese embassy evacuates around 1,000 students from the country.
One of my classmates tried to evacuate in a rented car with a Chinese family. The husband was shot in the waist while moving luggage. He was then sent to hospital. I hope he can get through this safely.
Well, the United Nations says almost 700,000 refugees have now fled to neighbouring countries. They're crossing from Ukraine into EU countries, including Poland, Hungary and Romania each day. Our correspondent Lucy Hoff is near the Hungarian border.
What was once a primary school for children has now become an aid centre. It's here where refugees arriving at the Ukrainian border are brought over by minivan to this centre to be given basic supplies of food, water, nappies and clothing. One of the volunteers who's been working on the ground is Masood. Masood, tell us about what you're doing here and why did you decide to come and volunteer?
Well, we're providing the basic services for food, their accommodation, temporary and long-term, and the transportation services for the people, those who came from Ukraine. So we're basically doing for them, those who are coming from the border. It's not too far away from here. So our organization is providing the transportation, and the persons, those who are coming from the Ukraine, they're coming from the border to here, and they're taking some water, food, and if they need accommodations temporarily, they're staying here, and if they need the long-term accommodation, they're providing here. And if someone wants to go to Budapest or somewhere else, they are providing the transportations. This is what we are providing here.
Well, thank you so much for the work that you are doing. Now, Hungary's warm welcome to those who have fled the violence in Ukraine does come as some surprise, given the scenes that we saw at borders like this one 7 years ago in the wake of the Syrian crisis. But despite the Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban's traditional closeness with Russian President Vladimir Putin, Hungary has said that it will be supporting that move to allow Ukraine to join the EU quickly. Now, the Hungarian government is saying that it wants to restore peace as soon as possible and is saying that refugees at centres like this one are welcome. The country is preparing to welcome large numbers. Lucy Hoff, CGTN, Berek-Surani.
The headlines again. Ukraine's emergency services say 5 people have been killed in a Russian attack on Kiev's TV tower. Moscow warned residents to leave their homes ahead of targeted strikes on the Ukrainian capital.
Satellite images show a column of Russian tanks 64 kilometers long heading for Kiev.
A standing ovation for Ukraine's president. Volodymyr Zelensky appeals for more help from the EU and immediate membership.
And that's it for Global Business Europe. Thank you for watching.
We'll see you again tomorrow, same time, same place. From all of the team here in London, goodbye.
Goodbye.